Hi, welcome to the Big Ideas series by XKDR Forum. Today we have with us Judge Kent Jordan, who has been a judge of the Third Circuit courts since 2006. And before this, Judge Kent Jordan was a judge at the District Court for the Court of Delaware. And before that, he has been a federal prosecutor, a law firm partner. So pretty much every single legal job that any legal professional aspires to have in their lives. Welcome, Judge Jordan, to the Big Ideas series, and we're glad to have you here.
Thank you very much, Bhargavi. It's my pleasure.
Great. So, as somebody who's been at the District Court of Delaware and who keeps track of how administrative agencies are really scrutinized in the United States, can you tell us the history of the Chevron decision? How did you all get to that stage where the courts had to take a call on how much deference should be allowed to regulatory agencies?
Yeah, that's an interesting and an important question. The Chevron decision from 1984, Chevron versus Natural Defense Resource Council, was it didn't spring out of no place. This was, but to really understand it, you need to understand that this was something that was a long time building, and the reaction to it was a long time building. So the separation of powers and the notion of checks and balances is built into the United States Constitution. Structurally, Article 1 of the Constitution is about the Congress, Article 2 is about the President, Article 3 is about the judiciary, and in keeping with Montesquieu's spirit of the laws, the founders thought it very important to keep these powers of government in separate hands. James Madison famously said that the combination of all three of those powers in a single set of hands was the very definition of tyranny. And they felt very strongly, those men who met in Philadelphia in 1787, that this had to be embedded in the U.S. government structure. And so it was. And it stayed that way. It's still that way today on paper, but there was a change that occurred toward the end of the 19th century as industrialization and the aftermath of the Civil War and population increases made the society more complex. And as a consequence of that, the very first independent federal agency was formed, the Interstate Commerce Commission, in the early 1880s, not sitting within a department of the federal government, not sitting in the executive office of the U.S. president, but its own independent agency to regulate what was then a relatively new technology, the railroads. And that idea that a new influence in society as dramatic as the railroads needed something to regulate and pay attention to it, that became embedded in the way people thought, I guess, about how the country should address new changes in the society, where there was a feeling that the government somehow has to have an eye on this. That gained steam in the late 19th century with anti-competition laws, and into the early 20th century. This was a bipartisan thing. The progressive Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive Woodrow Wilson both seemed to think, there needed to be experts standing above the fray of politics and bringing dispassionate wise expertise to these problems, and that this would all work out well. There was a strong German influence on that, and there was a sense that this was going to make everything better. That feeling that society was getting more and more complex and we needed to do something to address the problems of a complex society, that really took off when the Great Depression hit and the New Deal came in, and a lot of new agencies were established to do a number of things that were thought going to be helpful to pull the country out of depression and to keep a watch eye on what the private sector was doing. So from basically the beginning of the New Deal to 1946, with the proliferation of new agencies, there was finally a sense that who's watching these watchers? We've got now a number of agencies. Who's paying attention to them? What are the guardrails going to be? And because of that concern, the Congress passed the Administrative Procedures Act in 1946, establishing the rules by which agencies could properly formulate regulations, binding regulations, and explicitly giving the federal courts the jurisdiction to review agency actions. And that was viewed as a wise and a good thing. One of the senators that was behind the passage of that called it a Bill of Rights for the hundreds of thousands of Americans whose lives are affected by administrative agencies. And I think that was a good statement, but a real underestimate of what those numbers would be today, because Americans are, almost everybody is affected in some way by federal regulatory power. The sense that things were working out fine, that lasted with some ups and downs, with bipartisan consensus. And by working out fine, I mean both sides of the political aisle feeling like, these agencies are doing important work and we're behind them and we don't have to worry too much about that. That lasted without too much difficulty, I think, until, there was some pushback here or there, but things began to change dramatically when the Chevron doctrine hit. And Chevron, in essence, says, without citing the Administrative Procedures Act at all, says, if you have a federal agency interpreting a statute and saying and there's ambiguity or uncertainty in the statute about what exactly it means, federal courts should pay attention to that. In fact, defer to that, must accept that as binding. That was a very significant change from the time of James Madison, and John Marshall, had been the accepted idea, John Marshall's famous statement in Marbury versus Madison, that it is emphatically the duty of the judicial branch to say what the law is. Now it was administrative agencies that would be saying what the law is, and federal courts would have to defer to what those agencies were saying. That represented a very significant change. I don't think fully appreciated when it was put in place, but over the course of the last 40 years, it has made a dramatic shift of power into the executive branch, out of the judicial branch, and indeed out of the legislature, because it incensed the Congress to pass broad laws and let agencies fill in all the gaps.
Thanks for that background. So now that Chevron has been overruled by Loper, what do you think? I mean, what was the trajectory of this, of things leading up to Loper, where the courts finally said that, Chevron was, I don't know if they actually said it, if it has been overruled, it was a mistake. Did it tilt the balance of power too much? How did we come to Loper?
Yeah, there was a sense among many people in the country that post-World War II settlement, you might say, where things were viewed as the agencies are doing their thing, they're getting adequately watched over by the courts, had shifted too much with the Chevron decision, that now agencies really didn't have anybody watching over them. The agencies were calling all the shots. They could take a statute, give it a binding interpretation that everybody had to defer to, including the courts. They could pass regulations under that statute, which they could then also give binding interpretations to. They could enforce the statute, and then many of them could give their own adjudication of violations of regulation or statute, and that you were back to James Madison's definition of what tyranny is. There's all three powers of the government being exercised in a single set of hands. And because of that concern, real concern, that had grown and grown over the course of those 40 years. Eventually, with encouragement from lower courts saying this is problematic, agencies are doing things that we think are not the best, in fact, far from the best interpretation of the law, but we're powerless to do it. You need to do something about Chevron. Eventually, the Supreme Court took that case of Loper Bright, which was about fishing vessels having to bring people on board to supervise the fishing and make sure they were complying with the statute on the number of catch you could have. And then the boat owner had to pay for that, that this was an overreach by the agency, and it wasn't really in the law, and something, needed to be addressed here. And the court took the opportunity to do what lots of people, including me, think was the right thing to do, and say, this is inconsistent with the Administrative Procedures Act. And I got to say, I agree with Justice Thomas's concurrence in Loper Bright and Justice Gorsuch's, that it's also fundamentally inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution and the proper separation of powers and the checks and balances. So now we're in a new post-Chevron world, and I think a lot of people are interested to see what's going to happen. I believe there will still be deference in appropriate circumstances to agency expertise. Following on an older case called Skidmore, there'll be Skidmore deference, but there will no longer be the mandatory deference to administrative agencies required by Chevron.
Great. Thank you. This is really illuminating, and keep watching Big Ideas for more insights.